The year was 1865, in the dusty town of Abilene, Kansas. Felt heavier than usual under the harsh midday sun. The Civil War had ended only months ago. Yet the land still carried the weight of loss, broken families, and desperate survival. Among the people walking slowly through the dirt road was Margaret Hale, a lonely widow in her early 30s, who had spent the last year fighting to hold on to her small farm after her husband died of fever. She carried a basket for supplies, hoping to buy seeds and a little flour. But her mind stayed clouded with worry about the coming winter. As she passed the town square, a loud voice rose above the noise. "Next up for auction," the man shouted, "Native man, strong as a bull." Along with his 5 young girls, Margaret froze, her heart tightening. She had heard rumors of these auctions, where captured Native families were sold as labor under indenture contracts, a cruel system the army allowed to control those they captured. She hated the idea, but she had never been close enough to see it. Until now, a crowd circled the wooden platform, some men laughing, others whispering with interest. Curious, despite herself, Margaret stepped closer. On the platform stood a tall Native man, his hands bound in rope. His broad shoulders rising and falling slowly as he kept his eyes forward. His hair was long and black, his chest scarred, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood 5 small girls, the oldest no more than 10, the youngest barely able to cling to his leg. Their faces showed fear, dust, and exhaustion. They looked like they had been marched for days, maybe weeks. Margaret felt her stomach twist. The auctioneer lifted the man's arm like he was an animal at sale. "Look at this one," he said. "Strong back, good for fields, heavy work, lifting." "Building," the crowd murmured, but Margaret noticed something else. The girls shrank back each time a man stepped closer. One of the little ones started crying softly. Burying her face into her sister's dress, the father leaned slightly toward them, shielding them with his body even with his hands tied. Then Margaret heard a voice behind her. "Shame they'll break him up," a man whispered to his friend. "Farms don't want girls, only the man." Margaret felt her heart pinch. Break them up. Separate a father from his daughters. Something inside her shifted, like a door she thought was locked had suddenly opened. She looked again at the girls. They were thin, scared, clinging to each other like it was the only thing keeping them alive. She thought of the nights she had cried alone on her farm, after her husband died and she feared losing everything. Loneliness had carved space inside her heart, a space she never thought would fill again. But seeing these girls triggered something deep and unexpected. The bidding started. $10, a rancher called. "15, shouted another man. Someone else laughed and said, "Auction the girls separate later." Margaret's breath caught. She stepped forward before she even understood what she was doing. "20, she said, her voice steady but her hands trembling. Men turned to stare at her, surprised. The auctioneer raised his eyebrows. "Well, well. The widow Hale wants in," he said with a smirk. "You sure you can handle this big fella?" Margaret swallowed, but did not back down. "I'm buying all of them," she said quietly but firmly. "Not separate." A hush fell over the crowd. A few men scoffed, others muttered insults under their breath. The auctioneer laughed like she was joking all of them. "Lady, that's a whole family I know," she said, forcing her voice not to waver. "And I'm bidding on the family." No one challenged her after that. Some men stepped back, annoyed, others amused to them. She had done something foolish to her. She had done something she felt she was supposed to do. Even if she didn't fully understand why, she paid the fee with nearly all the money she had brought, her hands shaking as she passed the coins across the table. The ropes around the native man's wrists were cut, though the soldiers still watched him carefully. The girls stared at Margaret with wide, uncertain eyes, unsure if she was another captor or something else. Margaret knelt down to their level and offered a soft smile. "You're safe now," she whispered, even though she wasn't completely sure of it herself. The father looked at Margaret for the first time. Really looked. His dark eyes held strength, sadness, and a quiet question. She met his gaze with her own, nervous but sincere. "I have a farm," she said softly. "You can stay there." "All of you," he did not answer, but he gave a single slow nod. As Margaret led them toward the road, whispers followed her like dust in the wind. People said she was crazy, lonely, desperate, foolish, but for the first time in months, her heart felt awake. She didn't know what waited for her on the road home, but she knew one thing clearly. She had walked into town as a lonely widow. And she was walking back with a family she had never expected. Margaret walked slowly ahead of them, glancing back every few steps to make sure the native man and his 5 daughters were still following her. The sun was lowering behind the Kansas fields, painting the sky with streaks of orange and gold. Her small farm sat a mile from town, surrounded by rolling grass and a wooden fence that had needed repairs for months. She suddenly felt nervous, wondering what they thought of the place, wondering if they felt safe, or if they saw her as another danger. The girls huddled close together, walking quietly, their little feet kicking up dust from the road. Their father walked behind them, tall and silent, his steps steady, his eyes sharp, as if he expected trouble to appear at any moment when they reached the farm. Margaret stopped at the gate, letting the moment settle. "This is home," she said softly. Even though she wasn't sure what the word meant for them now, the girls stared at the house, a small wooden structure with a slanted roof and a chimney that leaned slightly to one side. Margaret felt embarrassed suddenly, realizing it looked worn and tired, much like she did, but the middle daughter, a girl with dark braids and curious eyes, took a small step forward. As if trying to understand this new place, Margaret offered a gentle smile, hoping it meant something to her inside the house. Margaret lit a lantern and set out bowls and bread. The girls watched carefully, unsure if they were allowed to sit. Margaret pulled out chairs, motioning with her hands. "Please sit," she said, her voice warm. "You must be hungry," the youngest girl, no more than 5, hid behind her father's leg. Peeking out shyly, he lifted her gently, placing her on a chair beside her sisters. His movements were soft, careful, almost tender in a way that surprised Margaret. She had expected a man of his size to move roughly, but he handled his daughters as if they were precious, as the girls ate quietly. Margaret noticed the father standing against the wall. "Not touching the food, you can sit too," she said gently, pointing to the last chair. For a moment, he didn't move. Then he walked slowly to the chair and sat, lowering himself with caution as though he didn't want to make a sound. He took a small piece of bread and nodded once as a sign of respect. Margaret nodded back, understanding the message even without words. The silence inside the house felt strange but peaceful. She had lived alone for so long that even the quiet presence of others made the space feel fuller. When the meal ended, Margaret stood and gestured toward the barn. "You can stay in there for now," she said. "It's not much, but it's dry and safe." The father rose from the table, his eyes following her movements with careful attention. He gathered the girls, helping them down from their chairs, making soft sounds in his own language to comfort them. Outside, the evening breeze brushed across the grass, carrying the scent of hay and distant rain. Margaret led them to the barn, lifting the wooden latch inside. There was hay stacked in one corner, a few blankets, and some tools she hadn't put away in weeks. "I'll bring more blankets in the morning," she said, feeling guilty that she didn't have better. The girls explored the space slowly, touching the hay, whispering to each other in soft, broken breaths. The father walked to the open stall, pushing some hay into a pile, shaping a sleeping area for the children. His strength showed even in small tasks, but so did his gentleness. Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure if she should leave or stay. She wanted to offer comfort, but didn't want to intrude. Finally, she said softly, "If you need anything." "Anything at all?" "I'm in the house." He turned his head slightly, giving a small nod. It was the same gesture he had given earlier, but this time his expression softened just a little, almost like he was saying thank you without speaking. When Margaret returned to her house, she sat near the window, listening to the distant sound of the girls settling down. Her farm had been silent for so long that even their quiet whispers felt like life returning to the place. She wondered what tomorrow would bring. Would they trust her, or would they stay distant? Would the town cause more trouble? Would she be able to protect them from the people who saw them as less than human, as the lantern flickered? Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in months, a sense of purpose. A sense that bringing them home had been the right choice, even if she didn't fully understand why. Outside, she saw the tall shadow of the father moving in the barn, settling his daughters gently, making sure they were warm. His silhouette looked strong and steady, a protective force she couldn't ignore. Margaret whispered to herself, "They're safe for now." Then she closed her eyes, letting the night wrap around the farm. The widow who had walked into town alone had returned with a fragile new family. And though they did not share a single word of understanding yet, something had already begun to change between them. The morning sun rose slowly over the Kansas plains, casting soft light across Margaret's small farm. She stepped out of her house holding a bucket of feed, expecting to start her usual chores. But when she reached the yard, she froze in surprise. The barn door was already open. The strong native man she had brought home was lifting heavy wooden beams as easily as if they were bundles of straw. His daughters worked beside him, gathering small sticks, arranging tools, and cleaning the floor of the barn as if they had lived there for years. Margaret watched them for a moment, unsure if she should speak or simply observe. The father noticed her, straightened up, and gave a respectful nod. He didn't smile, but something in his eyes looked less guarded than the night before. Margaret stepped closer and said gently, "You don't have to work this early." He touched his chest lightly, then gestured toward the barn, then toward her. It took her a second to understand. He was saying, "We work because you gave us shelter." The gesture warmed her heart more than any words could. The girls began to wander toward the yard, their bare feet kicking up dust. The middle daughter approached Margaret. Holding a small feather she had found, she placed it carefully into Margaret's hand, then stepped back with shy pride. Margaret smiled softly and said, "Thank you," even though she wasn't sure the girl understood. The girl nodded, her dark eyes shining with quiet trust. As the day continued, Margaret moved through her chores, but she found her eyes returning again and again to the family. Tahan, the name she had heard one of the girls whisper, worked with calm strength. He repaired the broken fence using fallen wood, lifting rails and posts with ease. At one point, Margaret tried to help him lift a beam, but he shook his head gently and motioned for her to stand back so she wouldn't hurt herself. It was a small gesture, but it felt protective, and it made her heart flutter in a way she hadn't felt since before her husband died. Around noon, Margaret prepared a simple meal, and the girls gathered near the porch, waiting quietly until she nodded for them to come closer. She placed plates on the steps and sat beside them, wanting them to feel welcome. The youngest girl touched Margaret's sleeve lightly, as if asking for permission before taking her plate. Margaret nodded, and the little girl's face softened with relief. Tahan sat a few steps away, watching his daughters, making sure they were comfortable before he took his own food as they ate. A rider passed along the road and slowed his horse when he saw them. He stared with a mocking grin and called out, "Didn't know you were raising a whole tribe now." Margaret, the cruelty in his tone made Margaret's blood boil. Before she could reply, Tahan stood up slowly. His body tall and broad, he didn't threaten the man or speak a word. He simply stepped forward, positioning himself between Margaret and the rider. The rider's smirk faded as he saw the strength in Tahan's stance. He muttered something under his breath and rode away, dust swirling behind him. Margaret let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding. She looked up at Tahan, who glanced at her only briefly before returning to his meal. But that moment changed something inside her. No man had stood between her and danger since her husband died. The protective gesture felt powerful, steady, and strangely comforting. Later in the afternoon, the girls followed Margaret into the garden, watching curiously as she checked the dry soil. The oldest girl finally spoke a single word in English, pointing to the dying plants. "Water," she said softly. Margaret nodded. Touched by the small effort, together they carried buckets from the pump, the girls giggling softly as splashes wet their dresses. It was the first time Margaret had heard them laugh. The sound filled the air like a forgotten melody, warming every corner of her lonely farm. When evening came, Margaret found Tahan placing freshly cut firewood neatly beside her house. She walked toward him and said, "Thank you for all this." He met her eyes with calm seriousness, then touched his chest again in that respectful gesture. It felt like a quiet promise. a silent agreement that he would protect her as long as she protected his daughters. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the yard. The girls gathered near the barn. Whispering and pointing at the brightening sky, Margaret stood by the fence. Watching the father and his daughters settle into their new life, she felt something she hadn't felt in months' companionship. Not spoken, not planned. Simply growing naturally, like a seed that had waited for the right moment to bloom. As night fell, she whispered to herself, maybe we can be a family after all, because in just one day, the silent bond between them had begun to form. Not with words, but with protection. Shared work, small kindnesses, and the warmth of hope slowly returning to all their lives. The next few days passed quietly on Margaret's farm, but the calm did not silence the growing whispers in town. People had seen her walk home with the tall native man and his 5 daughters, and gossip had spread faster than prairie fire. Some claimed she had lost her mind. Others swore she was hiding something dangerous. Margaret tried to ignore the cruel talk, focusing instead on helping the family settle into a routine, but deep inside, she knew trouble was coming one morning. She hitched her old wagon and rode into town to buy flour. Tahan stayed behind with the girls, repairing the chicken coop and gathering wood. Margaret hoped her quick trip would go unnoticed, but the moment she stepped into the general store, she felt the change in the air. 2 women stopped whispering when she passed, sending cold glances her way. The store clerk, who used to greet her politely, now only nodded stiffly. Margaret loaded her supplies quietly, but as she turned to leave, she heard a familiar voice. It belonged to Mr. Wilfred Granger, a ranch owner known for grabbing land whenever he could. "What's this I hear?" he said loudly. "Widow Hale keeps a whole tribe on her property." The room fell silent. All eyes turning toward her, Margaret steadied her breath. "I gave them shelter," that's all she said. Trying to stay calm, Granger smirked, leaning on the counter. "That's a dangerous choice for a woman living alone," he said. "Might bring the wrong kind of attention." Margaret felt the sting in his words, but she refused to back down. "They are a family," she replied, "and they're not hurting anyone." Granger's smile widened in a way that made her skin crawl. "We'll see about that," he muttered. Margaret left the store quickly, her heart beating faster than the wagon wheels. She had seen the look in Granger's eyes. It wasn't concern, it was calculation. If he could claim she was harboring dangerous natives, he might find a way to take her land. The idea made her sick with fear when she reached the farm. Tahan stepped forward immediately. Noticing her troubled face, the girls gathered behind him. Watching her with wide eyes, Margaret forced a smile. "Everything's fine," she said. Though she knew it wasn't, Tahan tilted his head slightly. Sensing the truth, he pointed to her chest, then to her head, as if asking, "What worries you?" Margaret sighed softly. "Wishing they shared the same language, there may be trouble," she whispered. But we'll face it, that afternoon Tahan worked harder than usual. Reinforcing the fences, checking the barn door, collecting stones to secure the chicken coop, Margaret noticed he stayed close to the house. Only stepping away to fetch tools or guide the girls, he was preparing for something. Using instincts, she trusted, even without explanation. 2 days later, the trouble she feared arrived. A group of soldiers rode onto her property, their uniforms dusty, their horses restless. At the front was a stern-looking captain, with Granger sitting confidently beside him. Margaret stepped out of the house, her hands trembling, but her voice firm. "What is this?" she asked. The captain dismounted. Pulling a folded paper from his saddlebag, "We received a complaint," he said. "You are keeping captured natives without proper authorization." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Behind her, she heard the barn door open as Tahan stepped out. The girls clinging to his sides, the soldiers shifted uneasily at the sight of him. Granger smirked again, knowing he had stirred fear on purpose. Margaret's voice tightened. "They are not dangerous," she said. "They have done nothing wrong." The captain scanned the family, then said sharply, "The man must come with us until we sort this out." The youngest daughter cried out and grabbed Tahan's leg. Margaret stepped forward before thinking. "No," she said, her heart racing. "He cannot go." Granger folded his arms. enjoying the moment. And why not? He asked. Margaret took a deep breath, feeling her bravery rise from somewhere deep inside. Because he is under contract as my farm laborer, she lied boldly. You cannot take him unless I release him. The captain looked uncertain. Indenture contracts were legal, and they did protect captured families from being moved without the owner's permission. Show me the papers, he demanded. Margaret lifted her chin. They are at the courthouse. She lied again. Filed 3 days ago. The soldiers looked at each other. Unsure, Granger stepped forward, trying to push the issue, but the captain raised his hand to stop him. We will check your claim, he said at last. Until then. The man stays as the soldiers rode off. Granger cast Margaret a long, bitter glare. This isn't over, he said quietly, before turning his horse away the moment they were gone. Margaret let out a shaky breath. Tahan stepped closer, his eyes full of something she couldn't quite name. Respect, gratitude, maybe even trust. He placed his hand lightly over hers, a silent thank you that needed no words. The girls wrapped their arms around Margaret's waist, clinging to her like she had saved their world. And in a way, she had that night, as the family settled safely in the barn. Margaret stood at her window and whispered, I won't let anyone take you, because the danger from town had only strengthened her resolve. They were hers to protect now, and she would fight for them with every last breath she had. The days after the soldiers' visit felt different on Margaret's farm. Something quiet but strong had settled between her and Tahan. He watched the road more carefully, checked every fence post twice, and never let the girls wander far from the yard. Margaret noticed each small act of protection and felt her heart tighten with gratitude she didn't know how to express. The fear might return, but she no longer felt alone in facing it. One evening, after finishing chores, Margaret saw Tahan sitting by the barn with a small knife and a piece of wood. He carved slowly, his hands steady, his eyes lost in thought. The girls played nearby, humming a soft melody from their own language. Margaret walked toward them, holding a loaf of fresh bread as she set it down. The middle daughter tugged gently on her skirt and pointed at her father. Talk, the girl whispered in broken English. As if encouraging him to speak, Margaret smiled, then sat down on the grass a few feet away, giving him space but hoping he would open up. Tahan paused his carving and lifted his eyes toward her. For a moment they simply looked at each other, the evening light softening the air around them. He touched his chest lightly, then pointed to the girls. My heart. My daughters, he said slowly, choosing each word with effort. Margaret nodded, waiting patiently. He pointed toward the farm, then to her. You gave. Safe, he said, his voice quiet but firm. Margaret felt her chest warm. I only did what anyone should, she whispered, though she knew most people wouldn't have done it. The girls giggled nearby, chasing each other around the water pump. Their laughter carried a feeling of peace across the yard. Tahan watched them with soft eyes, then looked back at Margaret as if something heavy had been sitting on his heart for days. He placed the small wooden carving in her hands. It was a tiny bird with open wings. Carefully shaped and polished, Margaret gasped softly. Touched by the detail and meaning, it is free, Tahan said slowly, tapping the bird, like you make them. His voice trembled slightly. Not with fear but emotion. Margaret swallowed hard, running her thumb over the little bird's smooth wings. It's beautiful, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The world felt still, the sky turning purple as the sun slipped lower. She saw something in his face she hadn't seen before, trust deepening into something warmer, something more personal later that night. The girls settled inside the barn with their blankets. Margaret brought Tahan a lantern so he could see while cleaning a broken tool. As she held it for him, their hands brushed briefly. The touch startled them both, but neither pulled away. Tahan looked at her with a soft intensity she wasn't ready for. Margaret felt her breath catch, her heart racing like she hadn't felt since her younger years. He spoke again, slower this time, as if building courage with each word. Before soldiers, he said quietly, I have. Wife. Margaret's eyes softened with sympathy. She died, she asked gently. Tahan nodded, looking down for a moment. Many winters ago, he murmured. Girls small. Very small, Margaret touched her chest, feeling his sorrow as if it were her own. She must have been a strong woman, she said softly. Tahan lifted his eyes. And there was gratitude. Their gratitude that she spoke kindly of someone he loved. He pointed to the bird carving again, my wife say. Heart must stay open, he said slowly, even when hurt. Margaret felt tears rise in her eyes. She whispered, That's a wise thing to say. Tahan nodded, then looked directly at her. You open heart, he said, tapping his chest. For my daughters. For me, Margaret felt her breath tremble as meaning settled gently between them. I didn't plan anything, she said softly. I only saw a father trying to protect his girls. Tahan nodded once, then stepped closer. He raised his hand and touched her cheek with the back of his fingers, gentle and hesitant, as if asking permission. Margaret leaned into the touch without thinking. The warmth from his hand felt like sunlight after a long winter. His voice dropped to a soft whisper. You kind, he said, strong. Like river, Margaret felt tears fall, not from sadness, but from something she thought she had lost years ago, being seen. Truly seen, she placed her hand over his, holding it against her cheek. Thank you, she whispered, her voice shaking. For a moment, neither moved, neither spoke. The connection between them felt natural, unforced, born from shared pain and quiet healing. Then a soft sound came from the barn, one of the girls stirring in her sleep. Tahan lowered his hand gently. But the look in his eyes stayed warm. He didn't need to say more. The truth had already been spoken in his simple words and gentle touch. That night, Margaret sat by her window long after the lantern went out. Her fingers still curled around the little wooden bird. She whispered to herself, He trusts me. He really trusts me, and somewhere deep inside. She understood that her heart, so lonely for so long, was opening too. Slowly, quietly, like a dawn rising after a long night. The morning after Tahan shared, his heart felt different on Margaret's farm. The air felt warmer, the sky brighter, and the quiet bond between them deeper. Margaret moved through her chores with a lightness she hadn't felt in years. Tahan worked nearby, his presence steady and comforting. The girls played near the fence, laughing softly as they braided flowers into each other's hair. For a moment, everything felt peaceful, almost safe. But peace never lasted long in Kansas, around midday. Margaret heard the sound of horses approaching fast. She stiffened, her hand freezing on the bucket she carried. Something about the sound felt wrong, urgent, heavy, angry. Tahan heard it too. And in one smooth motion, he stepped in front of Margaret. Blocking her from the road, dust rose in the distance. And soon, a group of riders appeared. At the front was Granger, the ranch owner who had filed the complaint. Behind him rode 4 men, armed and scowling. They stopped at the gate, their horses snorting and pawing at the ground. Granger shouted, You lied, Widow Hale. Margaret felt her heart pound, but she forced herself to stand tall beside Tahan. Granger raised a paper high in the air. The courthouse says there are no contract papers, he yelled. You broke the law, Margaret clenched her jaw. You tried to take them, she said. I did what I had to do, Granger sneered. You're harboring a savage and stealing government property, he barked. We're here to take him now, the youngest girl whimpered behind Tahan. Hiding behind his leg, Tahan placed a protective hand on her back. His expression hardening. His body shifted slightly, ready to shield them all. Margaret stepped forward before Granger could say more. Leave my property, she demanded, though her voice shook under the weight of fear. One of the riders dismounted and stepped toward Tahan. Move aside, the man growled, reaching for the rope on his belt. Tahan didn't move, his eyes narrowed. His stance rooted like a tree. Margaret saw danger rising fast. If these men tried to take him by force, someone would get hurt, maybe even killed. She rushed between them, spreading her arms out. Her voice trembling but fierce. You will not take him, she shouted. Not from me. Not from his daughters? Granger laughed bitterly. You think you can stop us? He asked. Margaret looked at the men, then back at Granger. "If you take him," she said, "you'll have to drag me too." That made the riders pause. The men exchanged uncertain looks. They hadn't expected the widow small, gentle, quiet to stand in front of a man like a shield. Tahan took a step closer, standing directly behind her. His presence alone made the riders tense. Granger's patience snapped. He reached for his gun. Margaret gasped, stepping back in fear. But before he could pull it fully from the holster, Tahan moved with swift strength. He grabbed a nearby rake and swung it across Granger's wrist. The gun flew from Granger's hand and landed in the dirt. The riders cursed, their horses rearing. Chaos filled the air as they tried to regain control. "Enough," Margaret shouted, her voice breaking like thunder. She pointed at the road, shaking with rage and fear. "You leave my land now," she said, "or I swear I'll go straight to the sheriff." The riders hesitated. They knew the sheriff respected Margaret's late husband, and they couldn't risk legal trouble. Granger glared at her, clutching his wrist. "This isn't over," he spat, his voice dripping with hatred. Then he turned his horse around and rode off, his men following reluctantly. When the dust finally settled, Margaret collapsed to her knees, shaking from the fear that had consumed her. Tahan knelt beside her immediately, his large hands steadying her shoulders. The girls rushed to them, crying softly. Burying their faces in Margaret's dress, she wrapped her arms around them all, holding them close as tears filled her eyes. Tahan touched her cheek gently. "Strong," he whispered. "You strong?" Margaret looked up at him, her voice weak but honest. "I thought they would take you," she whispered. "I couldn't let that happen." Tahan's eyes softened with emotion. He placed her hand against his chest, right over his heart. "You protect us." "I protect you," he said slowly. "Always." The word always lingered in the air. It wasn't a promise made lightly. It wasn't just gratitude. It was love, quiet, real, and growing stronger every time danger drew near. As the sun dipped low and calm slowly returned to the farm, Margaret realized something she could no longer ignore. She had saved him, and he had saved her. And now, they were bound together not by chance, but by choice, by loyalty, by courage, by the family they were becoming. The days after Granger's attack settled slowly into a calmer rhythm on Margaret's farm. But something had changed, not only in the air, but in the hearts of everyone living there. The fear that once lingered over them had faded, replaced by a quiet strength that bound them together like threads woven into one cloth every morning. Margaret stepped out of her home to see Tahan repairing something new, reinforcing the barn door, smoothing the fence rails, clearing fallen branches from the path. His movements were steady and purposeful, as if he was building not just shelter, but a future. The girls followed him like small shadows, giggling, sweeping, handing him small tools with tiny, proud smiles. Margaret found herself smiling more than she had in years. She cooked breakfast with a lightness in her chest, knowing she wouldn't be eating alone anymore, knowing laughter would drift in through the open windows like music. At night, she often stood outside her door, watching the lantern glow in the barn, feeling comfort in knowing she wasn't the only soul breathing on the land. One afternoon, Margaret walked to the well with 2 buckets. She was halfway there when she saw Tahan approaching from the field, carrying a beam across his shoulders. When he noticed her lifting the heavy buckets, he placed the beam down and hurried over, gently taking the handles from her hands. "You know, lift," he said softly. "I lift," Margaret chuckled, shaking her head. "I've been lifting these for years," she replied. Tahan touched his chest, then pointed to her. "My work now," he said quietly. Margaret felt warmth rise in her cheeks. His words weren't about labor. They were about care, protection, partnership. That evening, after supper, the girls brought out small clay bowls they had shaped from river mud earlier in the day. Each bowl was uneven, crooked, and adorable. They placed them at Margaret's feet like gifts, their faces glowing with pride. Margaret knelt and hugged each one, her eyes misting with emotion. The youngest girl pressed her forehead gently against Margaret's knee, a gesture of trust from a child who once trembled at every stranger. Tahan watched the moment quietly, his gaze softening with deep gratitude. Later that night, after the girls fell asleep, Margaret stepped outside to breathe the cool air. She found Tahan sitting on the small bench he had built beside the house. Looking up at the stars, Margaret sat beside him, their shoulders just inches apart. The silence between them felt warm, not empty. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "They won't come back," she said, meaning Granger and his men. "At least not now." Tahan nodded, eyes still on the sky. He lifted his hand and tapped his chest, then hers. "Here," he said softly. "Safe." Margaret felt her breath catch. The simple word held a promise deeper than any she had heard since her wedding day long ago. She looked at him, really looked at his strength, his patience, his quiet loyalty, at the man who had protected her without being asked, at the father who gave everything for his daughters, at the heart that had opened to hers slowly, steadily, like sunrise breaking over the plains. "Tahan," she whispered, "I want you to know, this is your home." He turned his head toward her, his dark eyes catching the lantern light from the barn. He reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. His fingers wrapped around hers with a warmth that made her heart tremble. He placed their joined hands against his chest. Right over his heartbeat, "My home," he whispered. "Because you," the world seemed to still around them. Margaret felt her eyes fill with tears, not of sadness, but of relief, of belonging, of love she thought she would never feel again. She leaned her head lightly against his shoulder. Tahan's breath steadied, his hand tightening around hers. No declarations were needed. Their hearts had already spoken louder than any words could. The next morning, the family moved into a new rhythm. Tahan began building an extension to the house. Using logs he had cut from the nearby woods, the girls gathered straw-braided ropes and carried small stones to help. Margaret brought them water, watching with quiet joy as her once empty home grew into a place that would hold all of them. Each hammer strike, each wooden beam felt like another stitch sewing their lives together. By the end of the week, the new room was finished, a warm, sturdy space where the girls could sleep close to the house. Tahan showed Margaret the strong beams, the smooth floor, the careful carving he had made at the doorway, a small bird with open wings, just like the one he once placed in her hands. Margaret traced it with her fingers, tears rising again. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Tahan touched her cheek gently. "You make us free," he said, "so I build." Forever, as dusk settled over the plains, Margaret stood with her new family, Tahan at her side. The girls huddled against her dress. The air was warm, the sky endless, and for the first time in years, her heart felt full. She whispered softly, "We choose each other," and the wind carried the words across the fields like a quiet blessing. Because the lonely widow who once walked into town with nothing left now had a home, a family, a protector, a partner, and a love she had never expected, but had found in the most extraordinary way.